But we begin in Beijing, where U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is meeting with China's foreign minister. Blinken arrived in the capital earlier to kick off 2 days of talks with Chinese officials. This is the first time in almost 5 years that an American diplomat has visited China. Blinken had planned to be there nearly 5 months ago, but that trip was postponed when a suspected Chinese spy balloon was caught flying in U.S. airspace. Patrick Falk is on the story for us from Singapore.
It is absolutely critical because if you've got the two biggest superpowers in the world at loggerheads with one another, tremendous differences and a genuine concern that this rivalry between the two countries could very well veer into conflict. So this is all about trying to manage that competition. And the Americans have made it very clear that one of the big priorities for them is to keep communication lines open, and in particular at a military to military level. Now, the Chinese seem to take a slightly different viewpoint on that and have repeatedly blamed the US for this deterioration in relations, in particular since the start of this year. And in fact, there was a phone conversation that took place between Qin Gang, China's foreign minister, and Secretary Blinken before this visit, in which he said, clearly, we know who is responsible. So to a certain extent, you might say that China doesn't necessarily see engagement as being absolutely essential, no matter what the risks or costs may be. And in fact, it has previously stated that it's not willing to engage while the US is suppressing China and sanctioning its officials and businesses and entities.
And Patrick, we know both sides here seem to be lowering expectations. What might success look like?
Yeah, it's a good question because it does seem as though very little can be achieved, particularly when you look at some of the pointed exchanges that have taken place in the lead up to this trip. By contrast, everything seemed relatively cordial when Qin Gang met Antony Blinken at the Diaoyutai State Guest House in Beijing today, but no doubt they will have had some very frank and tense discussions behind closed doors. We may not get to see the results of what this dialogue does for quite some time, but it is expected that it could pave the way for further high-level talks between US officials and possibly even between US President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The other thing that we are looking out for is whether or not the two sides might resume more commercial flights with one another. As we know, a lot of those were cut off over the period of COVID, and much of that really hasn't resumed. So this would be an opportunity for further people-to-people exchanges, and so it's a small but possibly symbolic step to show the two sides are at least trying to get on with one another.
Patrick Falk reporting in Singapore.